Not everyone can get up every day and look for ways to piss people off. But here at GraniteRock.com, we do that almost every day. I can't tell you how many times someone's lost their SHIT and threatened to end us. But we're still here, pissing people off. It's almost like we enjoy it. And we've been doing it since 2006. That's almost 2 decades of news, politics, and opinion, and now podcasts, and we're just getting started. We believe in principles before parties and politicians. We defend free markets and individual liberty, and if that makes you mad, it makes us smile. We're like Grandma after she stopped caring what other people thought. If that sounds refreshing, you need to check us out. This is Steve McDonald for Granite Rock, and we'll keep shining the light on them for you. Welcome back to Grok Talk, brought to you by GraniteRock.com and Grok Media LLC. My guest this week is Phil Kerpen from American Commitment, returning to talk about things D.C., Congress, and we're going to talk about taxes today, which is a great topic because every time you bring up something that has to do with taxes, Democrats scream, tax cuts and deficit, and they don't care about the deficit, and so that's kind of embarrassing. But anyway, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has come to it's about to expire. Congress is working, we could say diligently, maybe not, to make sure it doesn't expire. And why would they want to do that?
Well, we're looking at a $4 trillion tax hike come January 1st if Congress doesn't get their act together on this. And contrary to the Democratic talking point, this is not a tax hike exclusively or even primarily on the rich. This is a tax hike that'll hit every American that pays taxes. And in particular, it'll hit families especially hard because the child credit gets cut in half from $2,000 per child to $1,000 per child. The standard deduction gets cut in half. The estate tax exemption gets cut in half. All of the rates go up. And perhaps most significantly from an economic standpoint, the small business income exclusion, the 20% exclusion from taxation for small business income, that goes away completely. And so the effective rate on business income, non-corporate business income, goes from a 29% point something, 29% and change rate now to over 40%. And so small businesses get absolutely hammered. Really all non-corporate businesses get absolutely hammered if this happens. And the average family gets hit with a multi-$1,000 tax hike. And so the stakes are very, very high. There's a lot of pressure, therefore, on them to get this done. But we're into mid-April, and it took this long just to get the House and the Senate to agree on a budget resolution so they can start writing the tax bill. That took them months and months and months, and that was supposed to be the easiest part. And so on the one hand, they're kind of back on track in that they finally got that agreed to before they left town for this Easter break this week. But on the other hand, you know, we're more than a quarter of the way into the year, and all they've done is just barely cross the very first hurdle. So there's some danger, some risk, I think, that this goes down to the wire on a December dash on Christmas Eve week, which is what happened in 2017. And, you know, if that happens, even if they manage to get it done and we narrowly avoid this huge tax hike, there's going to be a huge amount of economic damage from all the uncertainty and the fear of this tax hike hitting in the meantime. So we really want them to get this done sooner rather than later. And it may be back on track, but we need to keep a lot of pressure on, I think.
So the White House says in their little version of what's going on here, they have this really nice clip from Rep. Stephen Horsford from Nevada saying that this is the biggest tax cut in history and it will screw America. Well, first of all, it's not a tax cut. And they're saying real wages, the benefits are great, that real wages could go up by $3,300 a year, that take-home pay for medium-income households could increase by as much as $5,000. Short run, real GDP could be boosted by 3.3 to 3.8%. And of course, these are the White House's numbers, so they're, you know, nice, rosy looking numbers. And then it would say 4.1 million jobs, and that distressed communities could see as much as $100 billion investment. Does that sound right to you?
Well, Steve, they say past performance is not indicative of future results in the disclosures for investment opportunities, but I don't know what there is. The best thing we have to go by is what happened when this bill was originally passed, and that is we did see this huge increase in median income. Median income went up about $6,000 between when it passed in 2017 and 2019, sort of before the lockdowns hit, and we sort of had a big drop because of that. And so, you know, these are policies that have been tried and tested and were extraordinarily successful. And this idea that somehow you're going to explode the deficit if you extend the tax cuts, I think ignores that there was more revenue in the 2 years following the tax cuts than in the 2 years before. Which is to say, the economic growth that we got and the benefits we got meant that revenues overall were certainly not down. In fact, they were up. And, you could say maybe they would have been up even more if the rates hadn't been cut. And, people have all these sorts of debates about whether you can say it paid for itself. But I can say without question, with these tax cuts in place, government revenue was higher than it had been before they were passed. And that's contrary to a lot of the official projections, which, of course, said the opposite would happen. And so this is a set of policies. And you're right, sort of the extension of the 2017 tax cuts is not a new tax cut. It's just avoiding a tax hike come January 1st, which is a really important distinction to make. But keeping these policies in place, I think, is very well justified by the experience that we just had. And I think even those numbers that you were just reading from the White House are pretty realistic in the context of what we saw when this was originally passed. And I hope my kids answer that so it doesn't just keep ringing.
That's okay. I'm waiting for my dog to
now
start
we
barking.
may, of course, yeah. I mean, this is exactly. Now we may see additional significant tax cuts as well, and in terms of things like no tax on tips, overtime, and Social Security, which of course the president campaigned on in this past election. So we may have some new tax cuts as well. But the most important thing, in my judgment, is avoiding those tax hikes.
Yeah, I know that everybody's interested in those things. Those are, things he ran on. No tax on Social Security, no tax on tips. New Hampshire has had some experience reducing taxes. We cut our business tax repeatedly over the course of several years and saw increased revenue. And this was, of course, when the Trump tax cuts came along. So there was a lot of things, positive things going on there. We just eliminated our interest and dividends tax, which was the only real income tax that we had, even though we don't have an actual payroll tax. And things were good. Things were really positive. And then a few years in, things have kind of slowed down a little. And a lot of that's the drag from the Biden economy. So I would really like to see these because I think a lot of states have an opportunity to benefit from having that weight taken off their shoulders.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a huge boom in tax cutting in the states the last few years, and a lot of states have either moved to a single rate tax or, in the case of New Hampshire, get rid of the income tax completely. And of course, you never had much of one, obviously, but to go to true zero is great progress. Of course, we had Washington State kind of move in the opposite direction, even though they've got a state constitutional prohibition on income taxes. They passed a capital gains tax and called it an excise tax, and their corrupt Democrat state Supreme Court said that was fine. And so they sort of have the asterisk that you used to have. It's still sort of like 8+1 with an asterisk. It's just you traded places with Washington State in the last couple of years. But we've had a lot of states go to flat rate taxes, and we've got a lot of states that are either at zero or near zero. And there's not as much that they can do in those states in terms of state tax cutting to get, economic growth and rising incomes, because they've kind of done most of what they can do. And, if you're in one of those states, you really need to hope that the federal government does their job and cuts taxes if you want to get sort of that lift economically. And so that is, I think, part of why this is so important is that, I'm all for federalism and that kind of thing, but a lot of states have done most of what they can do already. And it's really kind of on the feds to lower the tax burden.
Are there any Democrats who are on board with any of this?
No, the Democrats, it's incredible, actually. They've passed multiple versions of these budget resolutions because, remember, they were going back and forth trying to get agreement because that's the first step you have to do before you can write the actual bill. Every Democrat voted against every version. And so I think it's reasonable to conclude that the Democrats want full force $4 trillion in tax hikes, the child credit cut in half, the standard deduction cut in half, everybody who pays taxes paying higher taxes. It is sort of remarkable. I think that this has become so partisan, unlike, for instance, when Reagan did tax reform in the 80s, I think it passed 96-3 or something like that in the Senate. Even when Bush did his tax cuts, it got 6 or 7 Democrats, including people like Dianne Feinstein. That's like unthinkable now. There are basically no Democrats that want to cut taxes at all. And so that's why all of the action goes through this reconciliation process where you can sidestep a filibuster, but you've got to deal with all these procedural rules.
So I just lost my train of thought. Okay. So messaging on the Republican side. It seems like a no-brainer to me. You just pretty much laid it out. the Democrats want to double these taxes, and percentage-wise, it's a significant cost in the current economy, which is not great. And you might, make the case that they want the economy to fail. They want it to crash because it'll make them look better politically, which would cause a lot of pain to people who are hoping things are going to get better. Oil prices have come down a little bit. Gas is a little bit cheaper. Eggs aren't going up anymore. I mean, they're not going down everywhere, but prices have got a little better in some areas. But, this stuff doesn't happen overnight. And some of it's driven by perception. And as you pointed out earlier, if we get to the end of the year and this thing isn't done, people are going to lose their minds. But until then, and hopefully we can encourage members of Congress to accelerate the process, what's your advice to Republicans and anybody who's involved in this trench warfare about how to message this thing?
Well, I think they're way too worried about being attacked for tax cuts for the rich, which is sort of the one note that the Democrats and the media have that they just play over and over and over. And, we've seen these stories in the last few weeks about Republicans are considering a new $1 million plus tax bracket of 40% or even higher than 40% to prove that they're really not for the rich by sticking it to the rich with higher taxes. And I think they're overthinking themselves into a total disaster, because if they do something like that, they will no longer be the party that'll never raise taxes, which is the best thing Republicans have going for them. There are a million reasons not to vote Republican. There are a million things they failed on. But basically, since the George H.W. Bush debacle, they have been the party that will not raise taxes. And that gives a lot of voters a reason to vote for them when they might otherwise have none. And so, I think that they need to shut down that talk immediately. They need to say, we're not raising anyone's taxes. And they need to just explain that what happened. And frankly, after the 2017 tax cuts, the percentage of all income taxes that was paid by the top 1% went up to a record high, even though that rate was cut from 39.6 to 37. In 2022, the top 1% paid 45% of the income tax in this country, by far the record high, much higher than even when it was 95%. And it came down a little bit in 2023, which is the most recent year we have data. But even then, it was over 40% of all the income tax was paid by that top 1%. And so, if you're about soaking the rich, you actually do it with a lower rate. With the rate that we have now, we've seen precisely this effect because we had so much economic growth. We had so much money coming back into the country. You had the rich paying a bigger share than ever before because we cut everyone's taxes. And that's, I think, a key point for Republicans to make. Look, everyone who paid taxes got a tax cut under this plan because all the rates went down, the standard deduction went up. So nobody paid more, with one exception. The only group that paid more is people who had very high incomes and were paying huge amounts of state and local tax, because that was capped under this bill. So if you were previously, making $1 million in New York or California, and you were deducting the full, 100,000, 200,000 of state and local taxes you were paying, now that got capped. Now you might be paying a little bit more, although AMT being, the cap lifted on that offset some of that. But I saw one study that said 8% of New York filers paid more under these tax cuts. So basically the richest 8% of New Yorkers paid more, but everyone else paid less, even in a state like New York. And so, with this one exception of very rich people in very high tax states, everyone else got a tax cut. And everyone who sort of is middle income and down unambiguously got a tax cut. And so the share of income taxes paid by the rich went up under this plan. And so we don't need to give up. Republicans don't need to say, hey, we're now going to become tax hikers just for the rich to try to kill a Democratic talking point. What they need to do is maintain their brand as the party that'll never raise your taxes, but explain what happened when these taxes were cut, and that it was not at all tilted towards the rich. If you look at it in terms of the share of the income taxes that was paid, which is the right way to look at. The Democrats and the media want to look at the dollar amount of tax relief that goes to each bracket. But if you do it that way, of course, the rich will always get more, because even a small percent cut of people who are at the very top, it's going to be a large dollar amount. You can't compare that with a lower income person who gets their taxes cut in half or more, or even if you cut lower income people to zero, in dollar terms, it'll still be smaller just because the dollar amounts involved are smaller. So you have to look at it in percentage terms. And this was actually tilted away from the rich in percentage terms. So I think it's really important for Republicans to make the case about what happened using the facts and using those numbers. and not think that the way to appease the left is say, actually, we're going to raise taxes on the people at the top, which is this rumor that's going around, because that will destroy their brand. That will completely destroy their brand. And by the way, it won't raise money. It won't raise revenue for the same reason that cutting it didn't cost revenue, which is if you raise that tax rate, people are going to spend their time and money figuring out how to avoid the tax. Instead of just making money and paying the tax, you get a lot more avoidance behavior, get a lot less work effort on the margin. And so it'll be largely self-defeating if they go in that direction. So we're really trying to kill that rumor. They have it not, get any more life than it has. Republicans can't be the party that wants to raise taxes on the rich as the way to avoid this Democratic talking point. And by the way, Steve, even if they put a huge tax hike on the rich in this bill, they would still be accused of being tax cuts for the rich and a giveaway to billionaires, because that doesn't have to be connected in any way with the actual substance of what they're doing. And we know that for sure because at the beginning of the year, when the Senate was trying to do a budget with no tax cuts at all, and they had this idea, we're going to do two budgets in the same year, even though that's never been done before, they did this budget with zero tax provisions of any kind in it. And every single Democratic speech was, oh my God, this is tax cuts for billionaires. There were literally no tax provisions at all in that budget, and they still use the same talking point. So they're going to say that literally no matter what. Don't compromise yourself and put bad policy forward just to try to avoid a dishonest talking point.
Yeah, anytime you're not raising the budget, you're cutting spending. So basically, 100% tax would still be...
Well, that's another thing, Steve, about this budget drives me completely insane. So the House budget, they did this sort of goofy thing in order to meet this goal of getting a budget agreed to by the House and Senate by this Easter deadline, Easter break. Instead of agreeing on spending levels, they sort of agreed to disagree. So they've got different numbers for the House committees than they've got for the Senate committees. So when they actually write the reconciliation bill under this budget, there still has to be a fight over spending. Normally a budget would settle that, but instead they just said, oh, well, here are the House numbers, and here they just put different numbers in for House and Senate. It's how they got identical language passed in the House and Senate. And, a lot of that is this talking point from the Democrats and the media that there are these savage cuts to Medicaid, this evisceration of Medicaid in the Democrats' budget. And it's crazy because Medicaid spending is up more than 50% in the last 5 years. And it's up wildly, dramatically, in large part because Biden ended all eligibility audits. And so basically, if somebody went on Medicaid during COVID because they lost a job or whatever it was that made them eligible, and then they got a job and they should have been taken off the Medicaid rolls, they were not. They just, anyone who got on, they just left them all on because they stopped doing any eligibility audits. So the numbers went haywire. They went through the roof. You've got a bunch of states that exploited this to the maximum. States like California that used a sort of a money laundering trick to cover illegal immigrants, even though they're not supposed to be covered on Medicaid. And we've got this situation now where California, in their upcoming budget year, the year that starts July 1st, Newsom's got in his budget that he expects to get $120 billion from the federal government for Medicaid. So California is now expecting to get more federal money for Medicaid than the entire budget of the state of Florida. This is the kind of insane numbers that we're talking about. This massive, it's gone almost vertical, right? So what does the House budget do that is so outrageous to eviscerate, to viciously cut, to throw all the people? Steve, what they do is they say, you know what, we're going to swallow all of that 50% increase over the Biden term, but we're only going to increase 3% next year instead of the 5% that the baseline assumes. And that is the vicious cut or the evisceration that the media and the Democrats are talking about. So I really hope that Senate Republicans are not so skittish that they can't even slightly reduce the rate of increase in a program that's exploded totally out of control. And by the way, the last time an eligibility audit was done in Medicaid, which is back during the first Trump administration because Biden ended all the audits, the improper payment rate was 25%. So in a $600 billion Medicaid program, there was $150 billion of improper payments, if you assume that same rate carries forward to more recent years. So, I mean, it's I actually think they should be cutting it for real, like spending less this year than they did last year. But they don't even do that. They just slightly reduce the rate of increase, and the Senate, I don't know if we can go along with those numbers. So the spending fight is going to be much tougher, I think, even than the tax fight. And honestly, I don't know if they end up doing anything on spending because the Senate, it's about as close to zero spending reductions as you can get. What the Senate put in their version, like I said, there are different numbers for the House committees and the Senate committees. The House committees have targets of 1.5 trillion in savings, sort of not even real cuts, but reductions in the projected increase. The Senate has $4 billion, billion with a B. Each of the four committees of jurisdiction got a $1 billion instruction. And of course, Senator Thune has said, well, don't worry, we're going to make the House targets. We just put that in for flexibility. But I don't know.
Yeah,
we'll
but it's
see.
the Senate. It's the Senate. They're not they're spineless sloths. I don't know. Yeah, so about the deficit, obviously there's talk about how much more deficit we will get. And of course, we don't really know. We just have estimates. But if they don't cut spending and if they even just flatline it with tax cuts, what are people saying we're going to add to the deficit?
Well, the official sort of joint tax CBO score is that the tax cut extensions cost about $4 trillion. Now, I'm, as I said, pretty skeptical of that because they had a similar multi-trillion-dollar score the first time around, and instead revenues went up, not down. And you could say that was a coincidence, and maybe to a certain extent it is. But to me, it makes it very difficult to believe that extending these policies that work so well economically are going to punch a huge hole in the federal budget. If you look at what's happened in recent years, the deficit has more or less tripled in the last 8 or 9 years from about half a trillion dollars to $2 trillion. But that's all from spending increases. And if we could go back to a pre-COVID baseline, even with adjustments, and the senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, has showed this, if you just dial back to a pre-COVID baseline, but exempt defense and exempt Social Security and exempt interest and take that baseline and adjust it for inflation for everything else, we'd be at a balanced budget right now. And so, it's not a situation where, we've cut taxes too much. It's that spending has gotten completely out of control. And this is kind of a common story throughout U.S. history. Usually it's been wars, but this time it was a pandemic. But basically, you get some sort of a crisis or an event and spending ratchets up dramatically. And then it comes down a little, but nowhere near to where it was before. And, I hope that our guys really push to kind of explain this and use charts, use video, explain that the media and the Democrats are lying when they claim that even modest spending restraint is some horrible, vicious cut that we could never live with and all this kind of stuff. And, they're getting some ammunition from the stuff that Elon Musk is doing and the examples of waste and all that kind of thing. But I do hope that they'll be pretty bold on spending. Here's the challenge, though, Steve. We've got some House members, some conservatives, some of my best friends in the House, are basically saying, look, if we can't get the spending cuts, then let's blow up the tax cuts also and have a huge tax hike and, basically stick it to everyone for not agreeing to the spending reductions or at least, reforms going forward that we need. And I want spending cuts and reforms as much as anyone, but the tax cuts, which mostly paid for themselves anyway, if you end those, you're going to get huge negative economic effects that probably only exacerbate the deficit more because when you get a big, you go into a deeper recession or what have you, and then you spend a fortune on counter-cyclical programs and they'll probably do expanded unemployment again and all that kind of stuff. And so, it's a very dangerous game that they're sort of engaging in because on the one hand, you definitely want to have discipline on spending. That's the biggest problem we have in terms of the fiscal outlook. But on the other, if you hold the tax cuts hostage for that, you could get the worst case scenario. You might end up with no spending cuts still, but no tax cuts either, or big tax increases when the tax cuts expire. And so, I don't know exactly how this all shakes out, but it is it's a pretty perilous fiscal situation right now. And it would be great if there were some urgency felt on the spending side, which of course is what's driving these big deficits.
I understand what their concern is. I know that for most of our history, even if you just look at the last 20 years, when George Bush left office, was it 2008 in the midterm? No, 2008 when he left office, the national debt was 10.3 trillion, and now it's 37 trillion. And so, every time a Republican talks about cutting spending, really all they're really doing is just kind of hanging on to the giant blue Hulk, trying to slow him down from going forward much faster. And that really feels like where we are. And I can see how people get frustrated with that. We have that same problem here in New Hampshire. We have a lot of libertarians here. We have a lot of classic liberals who are true constitutionalists. And then, of course, we have Northeastern Republicans. And so there's this ongoing battle about what this should look like and how to talk about it and all that stuff. But yeah, I agree completely. I think that if they don't get tax cuts done and we do have an economic disaster, they're going to lose the midterms, and then we won't be able to fix anything because the Democrats will just stomp all over Trump, try to impeach him, and do all the rest of it. One more thing I did want to ask from earlier that I didn't get a chance to before we're done. You were talking about the hiking taxes on the rich, Republicans hiking taxes on the rich. Trump has announced massive amounts of foreign investment in the United States. He's announced a lot of domestic investment by people who are already doing business here. If you tell rich people you're going to tax the crap out of them, what does it do to that?
Well, I think it undermines it pretty significantly. One of the things they're talking about, which I think is way too clever, is they're trying to say, well, we're going to raise tax rates on people with $1 million incomes, but we're going to carve out business income completely. So it's only going to be wage income above $1 million. And then you're like, wait a second, like, what are we talking? So basically just pro athletes, like who has wage income above $1 million? Like there's basically almost nobody, there's like, how many people are we even talking about at that point? So then it's kind of like, so you're just going to destroy the Republican anti-tax brand, but like not really have any revenue for some tiny provision that applies to a tiny number of people, but is going to create the threat perception for everyone else that now you're willing to raise taxes. And so they've got a huge, huge problem because either it's just going to be an increase at the top, which is going to fall, almost entirely on business, which is going to be hugely negative for investment and capital formation in the U.S., or somehow they try to carve that out, which is this other rumor. But like, then what are you even doing? And someone told me today that maybe they're upset that so many pro athletes like Trump, and so they're trying to trick him into doing this so they can. It doesn't.
I was going to say
it's very strange. I don't get the logic.
It is. We're going to punish 0.0001% of the population to look good. That's a great idea.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
All right. So, any guesses? I know we've talked about this could take till Christmas. Do you think? Do you think they can get it done before summer's over?
Well, look, I didn't think they were going to get this budget agreed to by the Easter break, which was what Speaker Johnson said would happen. And so he's sort of beat the spread, at least on this first part, after months of standoff. And so, look, he says he wants it on the president's desk by Memorial Day. That looks pretty ambitious right now, but maybe it'll happen. I think more realistic is probably by August recess. If they're still stalled by then, I would say, Christmas Eve fumes would be the thing that gets it over the finish line. But I'm hoping it'll be much sooner rather than later for two reasons. One is that just economically, there's going to be a lot of damage from the uncertainty the more this slips in the year, with people saying, well, I'm not going to invest because I don't know what the tax is going to be next year. And sort of all of the paralysis that comes from uncertainty just goes on for months more, which is very harmful economically. But also, the later you get in the year, the more it looks like, hey, maybe Republicans are not all going to be able to agree. Maybe we need to cut a deal with Democrats. And then you definitely will get an increase in taxes at the top and a bunch of other undesirable things. And of course, this is what happened when Boehner cut a deal with Obama around the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. You got a very imperfect deal because it was bipartisan. And so, if it takes until very late in the year and Republicans can't form a consensus, then maybe that becomes the path of least resistance. And then you get a much worse outcome, I think. So I hope they can do it sooner rather than later. I think we have some cause for optimism now in that they got that budget resolution done. Although, as I pointed out, this is not what normally happens when you get agreement on a budget resolution, because they agreed to disagree on the spending levels. So they've got more lifting still to do than they would normally have at this point in the process. So, we'll see. But what I'm hoping is, this is the dream scenario. The House writes a bill that's so great and meets the spending targets and is so compelling that there's broad public support, and the Senate says, okay, we're going to pass it as is. We don't need to do back and forth. That would be the absolute dream scenario. And if they do that, they'll meet the Memorial Day deadline. So, we'll hope for that. But more realistically, I think the doing it before the August recess is probably what'll become the de facto deadline.
All right, Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment, thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right, my pleasure. Have a good one, Steve.
Grok Talk.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you'll make time to check out all of our podcasts brought to you by Grok Media LLC and GraniteGrok.com. Mondays at 8 p.m., it's Right Side Up. On Tuesdays, it's our live show from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time, Granite State Live. Wednesdays, tune in at 8 o'clock for Justice for All. Thursdays, 8 p.m., it's Grok Talk. Friday at 8 p.m., it's Manch Talk. Saturday, again at 8 p.m., The New England Take. And Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, it's Vermont Daily Chronicle Television. We are your source for local podcasts, news, politics, and opinion, brought to you by Grok Media LLC and GraniteGrok.com.